Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight, we'll guide you through the darkest corners of your mind, where shadows whisper and the unknown waits to creep up on you. These aren't just stories to scare you. They're designed to follow you into your dreams, making you question what's real and what's merely waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But before we begin, there's something you need to know. Most listeners make the mistake of leaving without subscribing, and by doing so, they miss out on the creepiest, most chilling stories that only the bravest dare to hear in the dead of night. Don't let that happen to you. Hit that subscribe button now, because the horror waiting to unfold tonight isn't just for the awake. It'll follow you into your dreams. So, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments, because as the night grows deeper, the horror is only just beginning to unfold. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and prepare yourself for what's lurking in the dark. My name doesn't matter anymore. I haven't used it in years. I move place to place, never sleeping indoors, never trusting walls, never resting too long in one place. You see, I've learned something ancient and true that I wish I hadn't. I wasn't always like this. I used to be normal, a freelance editor with burnout. I decided to take a trip alone to upstate New York, hoping to finish a manuscript in peace and get some clean forest air into my lungs. Solitude, I believed, would reset me. Instead, I found something that sleeps beneath the skin of this world. And now, it knows my name. The Airbnb listing had seemed strange, yes, but I chalked that up to poor SEO. A peaceful retreat near the Adirondacks, it said. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me, nature, and the sound of the wind. The photos showed a small, weathered two-story house, nestled beneath a canopy of pine and oak. The porch sagged slightly, the windows were bare, and the listing had 0 reviews. That should have been my first red flag. The second should have been the message I got from the host the day before check-in. Just don't go in the basement, it's sealed for a reason. I thought it was a joke, a horror-themed marketing gimmick. I'd read things like that on Reddit before. Airbnb creepypastas, all fun and fiction. I arrived just before sunset. The air had that crisp, metallic chill that creeps into the bones in early October. The house was silent when I unlocked the door. Dust floated lazily in shafts of amber light. The furniture was minimal. A wooden bed, a warped coffee table, a stone fireplace dark with old soot. There was a smell I couldn't place. Not decay, not mildew, but something thick and biological, like wet wool and old breath. I figured it was just the age of the place. That first night, I sat on the couch, reading. Around midnight, as the fire dimmed and the forest outside fell into heavy silence, I began to hear it. Breathing. At first, I thought it was mine, but it wasn't. It didn't match my rhythm. It was deeper, heavier, as if some great animal were asleep under the floorboards. The inhale and exhale were perfectly spaced. Slow, wet, deliberate, in, outside. I sat up, held my own breath. It continued. I crept to the walls and pressed my ear to the plaster. The wall was warm, like flesh, and behind it, movement. That's when I saw the wallpaper shift, ever so slightly, as if something beneath had exhaled too forcefully and stretched it outward. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was heavier than the sound itself. It was as if the house had become aware that I'd noticed. The next morning, shaken but still skeptical, I decided to search the house. It was too old, too quiet, too intentional. There were no rats, no creaks, no weather sounds, as though the place had swallowed every noise but its own. In the kitchen, I found a narrow cabinet above the fridge. Inside was a leather-bound journal wrapped in plastic and sealed with black string. The first page read, "Saint." Alora's should have burned, but it didn't. We just built over it. They never stopped breathing. The entries were written in a cramped, agitated hand. They told the story of Dr. Thomas Whitford, a 19th century physician who ran St. Alora's Asylum on this very spot. It had been shut down in 1891 after a series of treatment accidents led to 32 patient deaths in a single winter. Except they weren't accidents. Dr. Whitford believed certain patients weren't insane, not by human standards. He believed they had been infected by something cosmic, something older, something that lived underground. It whispered to them in their dreams, and they whispered back. When the institution collapsed, likely due to guilt, madness, or both, the surviving staff sealed the worst patients inside the foundation, not buried, entombed, standing upright in bricked alcoves so they could listen. They are not dead, one passage read, only dreaming. The deep dreamer beneath them breathes through their lungs now. It sleeps. But sleep is not death. I should have left then. I should have run. But the house had grown warm. That night was worse, so much worse. The breathing grew louder, more visceral. My bed creaked with each inhale, not from me, but from underneath. The walls expanded, then contracted. Dust fell in clouds from the ceiling, stirred by something moving in the foundation. At 3:33 a.m., I awoke not because of sound, but because of silence. It had stopped breathing, and then it spoke. I didn't hear it with my ears, but inside my bones. A deep, humming drone like language twisted through meat. You dream beneath me now. I ran to the front door, locked. The windows wouldn't budge. I screamed. The trees outside stood in perfect stillness, as if watching. Not with concern, but with reverence. The next morning, desperate and trembling, I searched for the basement. It was behind the laundry wall, a warped door nailed shut and covered in claw-like scratches. The journal's words echoed in my head, "The belly is always hungry." I don't remember opening the hatch, but I remember descending. The stairs were stone, cold, wet. The air grew thick with the scent of copper and mold. And then the chamber, a circular room of ancient brick, sweating blood-dark condensation. All around me, shapes in the wall, human but not moving. People buried vertically in the stone, their mouths open in silent screams, their chests rising ever so slightly in rhythm. They were still breathing. Their eyes followed me, though they were white and blind. In the center of the chamber was a pit. From it rose something unshaped. Not a body, not a monster, a form of pure intent. A mass of twitching tissue and roots pulsing like a throat, with no eyes, no mouth, but dreaming thoughts that spilled into my skull like boiling ink. I fell to my knees. I wept. I felt it, a sleep so deep it reached back before time. It hadn't noticed me until now. Now it had. I don't remember climbing the stairs. I remember light, then cold, then forest. I was outside, clothes soaked, face scratched. The house was gone. Only the foundation remained, black, rotted stone and a deep, square hole where the hatch had been. No one believes me. The Airbnb listing? Gone. The coordinates now lead to a hiking trail with no structures nearby. Even when I tried to show pictures I'd taken, all were blank, black frames. Sometimes when I lie under open sky, I can feel it again. That breathing, still dreaming, still deep beneath the crust of this world, waiting for another house to be built, another sleeper to listen. Don't fall asleep near old places. Don't listen to the walls. And if you hear breathing, that's not yours. Run. I never believed in curses. Superstition was something I always dismissed with a laugh. A quaint relic of older times when people didn't understand disease or grief. I was the kind of person who walked under ladders just to prove a point. That was before Salem, before her shop, before the roses began to rot. Now I sleep with cotton in my nose, my doors sealed, my windows boarded and my heart pounding like a frightened animal in a cage. It doesn't matter, the scent always finds me. It started with a vacation. I'd taken a weekend trip to Salem with my boyfriend, Alan. We were into spooky history, ghost tours, old cemeteries, that kind of thing. Salem had a flavor to it. Cobblestone streets, shops with hand-painted signs, a perpetual chill even in July. On the second day, we found it. Tucked between a taffy shop and a bookstore, there was a narrow, crooked storefront with a dusty red door and a wooden sign that read, Miss Olivine's Herbal Tinctures and Talismans, established. 1702. Alan didn't want to go in. He said it felt off and that the place looked more like a mausoleum than a store. But I laughed and stepped inside. I wish he had stopped me. The air hit me like a wall, thick with the scent of dying roses, not fresh ones. No, this was a heavy, bitter aroma, like dried petals left too long in damp air. Behind the counter stood a woman, tall, motionless, dressed in layered lace and a black bonnet. Her eyes were pale. Her smile looked too wide. She spoke in a voice like paper crumbling in fire. You seek beauty. You seek belonging. You seek to be remembered. I hadn't said a word. She extended a bundle of herbs wrapped in waxcloth and tied with what looked like human hair. A gift, she said, but all gifts seek return. I didn't want to be rude, so I took it. That was my mistake. We left Salem that afternoon. Alan joked about the creepy old woman, but I kept thinking about that smell. The dying roses, the suffocating sweetness of them. That night, back home, I unpacked my suitcase and found the wax bundle tucked inside my sweater. I'd forgotten to throw it away. Out of curiosity, I opened it. The herbs inside were black, shriveled and wet, somehow fresh and rotten at the same time. The scent of roses hit me again, so thick I staggered. I threw the bundle in the trash, but the smell never left. Every room I entered smelled like it, at first faint and tolerable, but by the second night it clung to everything. The curtains, my sheets, even my hair. I bought new soap, new clothes, washed everything. Nothing worked. And then, on the third night, I found the petals. I woke around 3 a.m. to an intense sensation, like something had been watching me and fled the moment I stirred. There, on my pillow, were 3 blood-red rose petals, soft, dewy, and fresh. Alan hadn't slept over that night. I was alone. The doors were locked, the windows shut. There was no logical way anyone could have entered, and the smell was stronger than ever. Not just in the air, it was inside me. I could feel it clinging to my lungs. Then came the whisper, a brittle voice so close it made the fine hairs on my arms rise. Return the gift. I turned the house upside down. Nothing. No person, no speakers. But as I searched, I found something far worse. In every room, petals, under my coffee table, in the sink, between the pages of my favorite book. Fresh, red. And when I touched them, they whispered. Terrified, I tried to research the shop. Miss Olivine's Herbal Tinctures and Talismans, established. Ayrıtı Yernutra Irinde, no online listings, no local business license, no mention on Reddit or Salem forums. I emailed the Salem Historical Society. They replied, there has been no such shop at that location since 1912. That building burned in 1933 and remains vacant. But I had pictures, didn't I? I checked my phone. Every photo of that street had a gap where the shop should be, like it had been erased from reality. The buildings jumped from 122 to 126. No 124, just a void. I tried calling Alan. He didn't answer. On the 7th night, I stopped sleeping. The petals no longer waited for me to wake. They bloomed as I watched. I'd lie frozen in bed, eyes locked on the ceiling, and see them growing around me, pushing through the walls, rising from the mattress like blood-soaked blossoms. Each time I moved, they'd crumble into black dust and fill the air with that horrid, rotting rose scent. I drove back to Salem, hoping to find the shop and return whatever it was I'd taken. But the street was empty. The storefront was gone. Nothing but a bricked wall between two buildings. No door, no window, just faded scorch marks and a lingering floral odor that made my vision blur. That night, I heard Alan's voice in my dreams. She gave me petals, too. I didn't return them in time. I woke up screaming. The petals were in my mouth. I dug through old records, desperate. I finally found it. A faded mention in an archived newspaper from 1881. Local apothecary woman, Olivine Crass, accused of witchcraft and botanical necromancy, known for drying roses in graves, claiming they captured a soul's final breath. House burned with her inside, no remains found. And then it clicked. The gift wasn't a bouquet, it was a binding, a promise. I had accepted a cursed piece of a soul, a dried tether to something trapped in death, and by throwing it away, I had broken the pact. Now the gift wanted to return through me. I live alone now. Alan is gone. No one remembers him. His number is disconnected. His family says he never existed. But I remember, he smelled like roses before he vanished too. The petals come daily, sometimes in my ears, sometimes under my skin. I've stopped trying to hide them. I bought a coffin, filled it with herbs, wax, hair, black roses. Maybe if I sleep inside, she'll take it back. Or maybe she'll bloom inside me. If you ever find a rose petal where it doesn't belong, your pillow, your wallet, the pages of a book, don't smell it, don't touch it, burn it, bury it. But above all, don't accept gifts from shops that shouldn't exist. The desert has a silence that burrows into your ears. It's not peaceful. It's predatory. Something deeper than loneliness. Something that watches you from under the sand and sky. I was on my way from Flagstaff to Los Angeles, burned out from work, fried by caffeine, and dizzy from sleepless nights. I wasn't trying to find anything, just move, drive, forget. I took the wrong exit sometime after midnight, and I never should have. The road wasn't even on the map. It was unmarked, narrow, paved in cracked asphalt that shimmered under the moonlight like black snakeskin. Then I saw it, a flickering neon sign in the distance, glowing sickly pink. Desert View Motel. Vacancy. There was nothing else for miles. I pulled in. The air smelled like rusted water and scorched rubber. The building was old, single-story, sun-blasted and falling apart, yet somehow untouched by time, like it had been waiting. Inside, the air was thick with a chemical citrus scent. Overkill to mask something far worse. The front desk clerk was a man in his 60s, skin like parchment, eyes milk white with cataracts. He didn't greet me, didn't speak at all actually, just slid over a brass key marked Room 6. His hand trembled slightly. "Do I need to?" I started. He shook his head. "No check-in." Then added, under his breath, "Don't open the curtains after 2 a.m. I blinked. "Sorry, what?" But he was already turning his back, vanishing into a side door without another word. Room 6 was plain, aged, but oddly clean. The carpet was worn thin. The bed sagged. The wallpaper peeled in strips near the window. The only modern thing was a small LED alarm clock by the bed. I noticed it immediately, the view. The window looked out across the open desert, but something about it didn't sit right. The glass seemed too clear, the view too still. There was no sound at all, no wind, no insects, nothing. The desert beyond was empty, dead. I drew the curtains closed and lay down. The clock read 1:47 a.m. Sleep came heavy and slow, but then I woke up at 2:14 a.m. Something pulled me from sleep, not a sound, but a sensation, like being stared at, not glanced at, observed, studied, pierced. The curtains were open. I hadn't opened them. Outside the window, floating 6 feet above the desert floor, were 2 human eyes. They weren't part of a face, just eyes, pale, wide, surrounded by darkness. The pupils were huge and wet and glistened in the moonlight. They didn't blink, they didn't move. They stared directly at me, no, not at me, through me. I couldn't look away. It felt like falling into a deep tunnel, a vortex of sight. I couldn't scream, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. And then, they were gone. No sound, no retreating shadow, just gone. The clock read 2:16 a.m. The next day, I tried asking about the motel in Needles, drove into the nearby town, asked locals, even checked at a gas station. The reaction was always the same. Silence, discomfort, eyes looking away. Finally, a gas station attendant in his 20s muttered, "That place? Ain't on the registry anymore, closed since '78. Ain't no one should be staying there." I told him I just had. His face went pale. He stepped back. "You need to leave, man. That place ain't right. People go in, but..." He didn't finish. I should have listened. But the desert does something to your mind. It makes you doubt. Makes you want to see what lies under the silence. I stayed. This time I sat up, waiting. At 2:14 a.m. to the second, they came again. More this time. 4 pairs of eyes. 6, 12, floating in formation outside the window, unblinking, perfectly still. And then they moved together like fish in a school, synchronized, silent, and one by one, they began to pass through the glass, like it wasn't there, like the boundary between here and there didn't matter to them anymore. They hovered around the room. I felt them inside me, not physically, psychically. They were reading me, dissecting thought, excavating memory, and I saw something in return, an image, a memory not my own. A vast, ancient desert temple buried beneath the Mojave, filled with mirrors. A place where sight was sacred, where seeing was worship, and being seen was sacrifice. This motel, this room, it sat on top of it. A window into the old place, a slit in reality, and I was in the way. I tried to flee. The car started fine this time. Everything worked, as if the place was done with me, for now. I drove and drove, far from Needles, far from California, but the eyes came with me. No matter where I slept, a hotel in Vegas, a cabin in Colorado, even my apartment back home, the eyes came. At exactly 2:14 a.m., they hover now outside whatever window I'm near. They don't always come in, but sometimes they do, and they're looking deeper. They're not interested in me. They're looking through me into what I can't see, into something behind the world, a doorway, a gate. And I know now, the motel wasn't a motel. It was a watching place, a lens, a focusing eye for something else. And I was just the lens cap. It's 2:13 a.m. now. I can feel them already. The air is thick. The lights flicker. They're not at the window anymore. They're inside the room. They're watching me as I write this. If you find this note, if you ever feel eyes on you in the dark, don't look back. And for God's sake, don't stay in room 6. When my grandfather died, I was the only one who came to settle his estate. He'd lived alone for decades on a vast stretch of farmland near Wolf Creek, Montana. The kind of land where sky swallows everything and the wind never stops whispering. His will was thin and simple, naming me sole heir, though I hadn't seen him since I was a boy. My father never spoke of him after a certain year, 1987, I think. He burned all the old letters one night, saying only, he chose the dark. The house was crooked and full of dust, but solid. The barn was another story. Ancient, wood-gray as bone, slanted like a drunk. No animals remained. Just empty pens, rusted tools, and something wrong in the air. It smelled not of hay, but something metallic, like dried blood and wet stone. That first night, I dreamed of things moving beneath the earth. On the third day, while clearing debris from the barn's back wall, I found a door I'd never seen before. Sunlight caught on iron hinges set into the floor. A square trapdoor, expertly sealed and covered by old planks and hay bales. It was locked. But the key came to me in a strange way. Inside a Bible on grandfather's bedside table, between the pages of Isaiah taped with yellowing thread, was a single brass key with a spiral carved into the bow. Spiral like a snail shell or a drain. When I opened the trapdoor, a gust of air hit me. It was cold and moist, and carried the scent of soil that hadn't seen light in centuries. Beneath was a stone staircase, steep and narrow, vanishing into the dark. Something in me said, "Don't." But another part whispered, "You've always been meant to find this." So I went down. The stairs ended in a large underground room, brick walls, old lanterns, and a wooden desk covered in mold-specked papers, shelves filled with books wrapped in wax cloth. I found a leather journal tied with frayed cord, dated 1912, written in my grandfather's trembling hand. They are older than the stone, older than man. We were not the first to plow this land. We are only permitted to forget. It feeds on what's left behind. Names, dreams, songs no one sings anymore. It eats the space we make with silence. It promised that if we gave it what was lost, it would make us remember more than men were meant to. But the price? There were pages torn out, burned edges, smears of ink like claw marks. Beside the journal, I found a small wooden box. Inside, teeth. Not human, not animal. Thin, long, curved like fish hooks, each one humming faintly when I touched them, as if full of voices that had no mouths. Further into the tunnels I went. They stretched like veins under the earth, miles, maybe more. Some places were so narrow I had to crawl. Other chambers were so vast they echoed for minutes. The walls were carved with symbols, spirals, loops, circles crossed with X's, patterns that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. And the deeper I went, the less I remembered. It started small. I forgot where I put my flashlight, then forgot what day it was. Then I couldn't remember my own middle name. By the seventh chamber, I couldn't remember why I came. I only knew this place felt familiar, like I'd always known it, like it had been waiting for me. In the last tunnel, I found it, not with my eyes, not at first, with my soul, a presence, a pressure behind the eyes, like someone watching me through my own skull. Then came the sound, not footsteps, not breath, lack, like the air was being eaten, a sound like memories being chewed. Then the light failed, and I saw it, a shape too big to fit in the tunnel, yet it did, writhing, coiling, no true form, just folds of flesh and shadow and mouths with no teeth, whispering prayers in long dead languages. The smell was unbearable. Mildew, copper, roses left to rot. It didn't move. It pulsed. And I knew this was the forgotten one. The thing my grandfather served. The thing he built the cult for. The thing that fed on everything we left behind. It didn't want worship. It wanted my mind. Not to read, but to strip clean. I don't know how I got out. I only know I woke up in the barn, hours, maybe days later. My clothes were covered in dirt. My fingernails were cracked and bloody. My memory? Swiss cheese. I can't remember my parents' names. Can't remember where I was born. Sometimes I forget how to use the microwave. But I remember the tunnels, and I remember it. I tried sealing the trap door, burned the journals, sold the farm. But I still hear it, sometimes. When I close my eyes, a sucking sound, like something drinking from my skull. Sometimes I wake up with soil under my fingernails. Sometimes I dream I'm still down there. Maybe I never left. Maybe the man who walked out of that tunnel wasn't me. And worst of all, every day, I remember less. They always say, don't buy a house too cheap. There's usually a reason, but I didn't listen. I'd just gone through a nasty divorce and was desperate for a fresh start. When the listing popped up, a fully renovated 2-bedroom house in the College Hill neighborhood of Cincinnati for half the market value, I jumped at it. New floors, fresh paint, updated appliances, perfect, too perfect. From the first night, something felt wrong. The house had cold corners, not in the way of temperature but in mood, like certain spaces hadn't been warmed by life in a very, very long time. The laundry room especially, it had this stale, almost ancient scent, like dried herbs and mildew and something worse, like old paper soaked in tears. I tried to brush it off. I was just being paranoid, until I heard her. It started on a Thursday night. I was half asleep sitting on the couch, listening to the dryer tumble. It made that soft, rhythmic hum, thump, thump, whir, thump, thump, whir. Then came something else. At first, it sounded like static, a soft, low hiss, like steam seeping from a pipe. I muted the TV. Still there. Then it became a voice. A woman's voice, quiet, broken, and trembling, coming from the dryer vent. Help! Me! My blood ran cold. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes. The voice stopped. I stared into the mouth of the dryer, dark, still spinning, expecting to see a face pressed against the metal drum. There was nothing, just warm towels. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next week it got worse. The voice returned every night. First a whisper, then a chant, then something else. Language that wasn't human. Not gibberish, not random sounds, but syllables with rhythm and meaning. Words that scratched the inside of my skull like fingernails. Yanalath, Danarath, Kartilha. The tone was both pleading and commanding, like a prisoner reciting a spell meant for her captor. I started dreaming in those words, waking up with them burning behind my eyes. I wrote them down, pages and pages, the same 5 words over and over. On the 7th night, I woke to find rose petals on my pillow, fresh, wet, decayed, and the scent, rotting roses, thick and sickly sweet, filled every room, even though I kept no flowers. That's when I called someone. The plumber's name was Vic. Big guy, smelled like cigarettes and coffee. I didn't tell him about the voice, just asked him to check the vent system. He pulled the dryer away from the wall and froze. What the hell? Behind the dryer, instead of a standard aluminum duct, was an iron grate, circular and ancient, blackened with age, carved with symbols neither of us recognized. It wasn't connected to any normal ventilation system. It led into the wall, into blackness. Vic tapped it with a wrench. It rang like a bell, and something responded, a moan, low and wet, like a woman sobbing under miles of dirt. Vic dropped his wrench and backed away. I'm not touching that. You need to call someone else. Before he left, he muttered, "You ever hear about the tunnels under the city? The old asylum beneath the hill? They say some things were buried and sealed." Then he slammed the door and drove off. I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. I spent the night searching the history of my neighborhood. Turns out, in the 1870s, there was a private sanitarium less than half a mile from where my home now stood. It was called the Hollenbeck Retreat, a treatment center for women suffering hysteria and demonic delusions. They buried them alive, Rahman. Not metaphorically, literally. Records show 12 women were declared deceased, but no death certificates were filed. Locals later reported hearing weeping under their floorboards. The retreat was shut down in 1882. The building was razed, but they never filled the tunnels. And now those tunnels run under Mercer Lane. That night, I sat in front of the dryer vent. The voice was louder than ever. Return. Return what was sealed. We are still dreaming. My fingers trembled as I unscrewed the iron plate. Behind it, a narrow, slick tunnel stretched into pure darkness, pulsing gently like a throat. I don't know what made me crawl in. I just know I had to. I slid forward on my stomach, the walls tight, damp. The smell of dead roses and salt burned my nose, and then I reached a chamber, circular, domed, with roots like veins running across the stone. In the center was a mirror, fractured, ancient. Behind it, floating inside the glass, was the woman's face, hollow-eyed, her lips mouthing words with no sound. And I realized she wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking through me to it. It, that great forgotten hunger, sealed in the dark below Cincinnati. It, that old hunger that once fed on hysteria, delusion, forgotten pain. I was its new vent, its new mouth. And now it speaks through me in every room. I never left the house. I couldn't. I don't think I'm allowed. The rose petals still appear every night. The mirror in the laundry room fogs from inside. The whispers have changed. They now thank me. And every time I speak, even to strangers, even to you reading this, a part of it comes through. If you ever hear a soft voice in your vent, a woman crying, then chanting, don't listen, don't respond. And above all, don't return the gift. They were just trying to start a quiet life. Chris and Lila Thompson had moved into the modest home on Camden Street, a tree-lined suburban corner of Omaha, Nebraska. They were first-time parents. Newborn girl, Emma, just 6 months old, quiet, calm, slept like a dream. The house wasn't old, but it had character. Creaky baseboards, wide crown molding, and a nursery that overlooked the backyard. Nothing unusual, nothing ominous, except the closet in the nursery. That was the only thing Lila didn't like. I don't know, she had said one night, chewing her lip. It just feels off. Chris had laughed it off. It's a closet, babe. But as with most Lovecraftian horrors, what lurks behind doors isn't always physical. Sometimes it's ancient and waiting. They used a baby monitor with night vision, one of those newer models with real-time video and audio. Every night around 2 a.m., Lila would wake and check the screen. Emma was always asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling, peaceful, safe, until the 4th week. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the feed went static, then slowly refocused. That's when Lila saw him, a tall, thin figure standing beside the crib, motionless. His face was bone white, not pale skin, literal bone like the stripped skull of some forgotten thing unearthed from beneath frozen soil. Black, sunken eyes, a jaw that didn't quite close. He stood there for hours, unmoving, staring down at Emma. But when Chris ran upstairs, the room was empty. Emma was still asleep. The closet door was open, just slightly. They checked the footage. There was nothing on the recording. Lila tried to convince herself it was a glitch, a shadow, some weird interplay of angles and light. But every night at 2:13 a.m., the bone-faced man returned. Always in the exact same position, always beside the crib. He never moved. He never looked at the camera. He just stared at Emma as if remembering her from somewhere deep, somewhere pre-human. Emma, for her part, remained perfectly quiet. No crying, no fear, almost like she knew him. That was worse. 2 weeks later, Emma said her first word. It wasn't mama, it wasn't dada, it was bones. She repeated it over and over, sometimes in the morning, sometimes during sleep, sometimes while pointing at the closet door. Chris tried to rationalize it. She's just mimicking sounds, probably something she heard on TV. But Lila knew. Deep down, she knew Emma wasn't repeating something. She was remembering something. They nailed it shut. Chris, frustrated and desperate, took a hammer and nails and sealed the closet closed. He put a baby gate across the nursery door. He even installed motion sensor cameras. The next night, they saw something impossible. The baby monitor turned on by itself. The feed showed the crib empty. But Emma was still in her crib, sleeping soundly, then in the monitor's image, not in real life, just the screen. The bone-faced man bent down and whispered something in Emma's ear. The screen went black. When they rushed into the room, the closet door, which had been nailed shut, was wide open. Nails pulled out, not pushed in, as if something had been inside all along. Chris called the cops. They searched the entire house, checked for signs of forced entry, found nothing. No footprints, no fibers, no broken locks, no signs of anyone ever being there. Just the closet, cold as a crypt, dry but lined with strange scratches. One officer ran his fingers over the wood and said, "These look old. Not from tools, from something else, something with fingers." They filed it under unexplained disturbance and left. But something stayed behind. Over the next week, Emma changed. She no longer babbled, no longer smiled. She just watched the closet, watched her parents, watched the monitor, and one night, Chris swore he saw her mouth moving, silently mimicking the whispers from the monitor. Lila found drawings in her crib, tiny claw-like scratchings on the wooden slats, shapes of circles and spirals, things that shouldn't be known to a child. When asked, Emma said only, "He's not gone. He just wears the closet when the sun is up." The Thompsons moved. They packed up and left within days, fleeing to Colorado to stay with family. Emma hasn't spoken since. The house on Camden Street was sold again, then again, and again. Each new owner reported strange interference on baby monitors even when no baby was present. The local kids say the house breathes if you listen hard enough. That at night you can still hear a low voice saying "bones" through the walls. And the closet, they say it always swings open around 2:13 a.m., just wide enough for someone bone-faced to step through. Lila once showed a still image to a paranormal investigator. It was from their first week in the house. The baby monitor feed, before anything strange had happened. He stared at it, frowning, then pointed to the far left corner, almost invisible in the grain. There, nearly obscured by shadow, was a faint figure, tall, still, and smiling. He wasn't haunting the monitor, the investigator said. He was using it to look back. Margaret Greer, a bright but unassuming college student, had never been one to indulge in superstition or irrational fear. She was pragmatic, a rationalist through and through, focused more on her textbooks than the fading rumors surrounding the old homes in Savannah. Her parents had been thrilled when she found a place to rent for the upcoming semester, a modest, ivy-clad house on Oak Street, just a short walk from the college. The rent was shockingly affordable, which was rare in a city known for its haunted past and expensive real estate. The house, as the landlord explained, had always been a safe haven for students, never having had any issues with previous tenants. Yet, beneath the house's charm, there was something not quite right about it. The first night Margaret arrived, she felt an unusual chill despite the summer heat. The air in the house was stifling, thick with dust and the faint scent of something stale. It was as though the house had been abandoned for longer than it had actually been empty. She spent the next few days unpacking, arranging her books and clothing into the small but cozy space. The attic door was an oddity, a heavy old thing half concealed in a hallway that connected the living room to the kitchen. It was small and narrow, almost too small to be practical, and the heavy latch on it suggested that it had been sealed for years. Despite the sense of unease that lingered in her chest, Margaret dismissed it as the natural discomfort of settling into an unfamiliar space. She had work to do after all. On the third night, the sounds began. It started as a faint, rhythmic noise, a grinding as if old, brittle porcelain was being scraped against a rough surface. Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, but the noise kept her awake. The grinding was not loud enough to be bothersome, but it was there. It wasn't the sound of the house settling. That much was clear. She rolled over and glanced at her clock. 3:15 a.m. The noise grew louder. Closer, she sat up, heart pounding. It was coming from the attic. Margaret was no stranger to the odd noises that old houses produce. A house as ancient as this one would inevitably creak and groan in the night. She had convinced herself of that, at least, as she reluctantly settled back into bed. But the grinding continued. The next day, while the house was bathed in the warm light of an early afternoon sun, Margaret decided to investigate the attic. She had been trying to avoid it for days, but her curiosity got the better of her. The landlord had claimed the attic was inaccessible, sealed with nails and heavy beams for safety, but Margaret was growing desperate to understand the sounds that had been keeping her awake. When she opened the door, a musty scent flooded the room. Stale air and dust that had been undisturbed for far too long. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, forgotten books, and boxes of discarded items, most of them covered in thick layers of dust. She pulled the small, shaky light from her pocket and stepped inside. As she moved deeper into the attic, something caught her eye. Amid the dust and forgotten relics of other tenants, something shimmered. Teeth. Scattered throughout the attic floor, interspersed with the dust, were hundreds of human teeth. Large, small, broken whole. A macabre carpet of bone fragments yellowed with age, gleaming faintly in the dim light. Margaret recoiled, a sense of nausea gripping her throat. She knelt down to examine them, but as she touched the nearest tooth, a wave of dizziness hit her. The room seemed to tilt, as though the very foundation of the house was shifting beneath her feet. She quickly stumbled backward, her mind racing to understand the impossible scene before her. Who would put teeth in the attic? Why? And more importantly, how long had they been here? Margaret's hands were trembling as she called the landlord. She could barely speak, but she managed to force out her question about the teeth. The landlord's voice, initially calm, shifted to irritation. "There are no teeth in the attic," he insisted. "It's been sealed for years. I don't know what you're talking about, but I suggest you leave the attic alone." Margaret didn't argue. She ended the call quickly, more disturbed by his defensiveness than his denial. The next day, she went to the local library and researched the house. There was no mention of any tragic history, no hint of any previous tenants who might have hidden such a thing. But the city of Savannah was known for its secrets, its past buried deep under the layers of history and myth, and some things were best left undiscovered. That night, the grinding returned, louder than ever. Margaret tried to ignore it, to block out the gnawing, aching noise that seemed to vibrate through her skull. But the closer she got to sleep, the closer it came. By 2:30 a.m., the noise was no longer coming from the attic. It was in the walls, as if something was grinding its teeth behind every surface. It reverberated through the floors and up into her bones. It was relentless. Then came the whispering, a soft murmur, low and indistinct, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from everywhere, but nowhere at once. The only words she could make out were, "Feed me, feed me, with your memory." Margaret froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if the very air around her was thickening, suffocating. The following week, Margaret tried to leave the house, but something was wrong. Her mind was foggy, confused. She felt like she was forgetting something, but when she tried to recall it, the memory slipped away from her grasp, like smoke between her fingers. Each night the grinding grew louder, and the whispers became more insistent. The attic door, which had once seemed so sealed, began to creak open by itself. The teeth multiplied, covering the floors of the attic, the walls, even the windowsills. When Margaret tried to leave, she could never quite remember why. Her mind grew clouded with something else, a hunger that she could not name. The more she tried to understand, the more she became part of the house's forgotten history. The last time anyone saw Margaret was when she walked toward the attic door, her hands trembling as she reached for the latch. The door was never closed again. The house on Oak Street remains there, just as it has always been. A quiet, unassuming building on a quiet, unassuming street. Every now and then, a student rents it, and every now and then, they too hear the grinding of teeth in the night. Those who stay too long forget. They become part of the house, feeding it with their memories, their fears, and sometimes when the sun sets over Savannah, you might hear soft whispers coming from the attic, begging for more. There is a place in the Black Hills of South Dakota where the trees are ancient and the wind whispers of long-forgotten things. It is not a place where many people venture, for the locals speak in hushed tones of the darkness that lingers in the forest. But for Michael, Sarah, and Jordan, it seemed the perfect place for a weekend of camping, a place to escape the noise of the world and reconnect with nature. They were three friends, close-knit and adventurous, each seeking to leave behind the mundane burdens of modern life. The Black Hills, with their towering pines and the silence that seemed to stretch on for eternity, promised a quiet solitude. As they trekked deeper into the forest, their spirits were high, their laughter echoing under the thick canopy of trees. There was something, however, in the air, something heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. But they, in their youth and brimming optimism, paid it no mind. It was simply the magic of the wilderness, they thought. By the time the sun had dipped behind the mountains and the stars began to emerge, the three friends had set up their camp. A fire crackled merrily, and the scent of pine and burning wood filled the air. They spoke of their plans, their dreams, and their fears, but nothing could have prepared them for the strange occurrences that would follow. The first sign came around midnight. Michael, who had been dozing lightly, was stirred by an unfamiliar sound. A faint scratching, as if something was brushing against the fabric of the tent. He sat up, heart pounding, eyes adjusting to the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. But there was nothing. Only the wind rustling the leaves. He tried to dismiss the unease that lingered in his chest, but when he glanced over at Sarah and Jordan, they too were awake, their eyes wide and their bodies tense. Something was wrong. At the crack of dawn, Michael was the first to leave the warmth of the tent. His legs stiff from the cold, he stretched and squinted against the pale light of the morning. It was then that he noticed something odd, something that sent a chill creeping up his spine. Around their campsite, a circle of footprints had formed. Not regular human prints, but strange, elongated tracks, as if something or someone had walked in a manner alien to anything he had ever seen. The prints were too long, too thin, with a deep indentation where the heel should have been, but no center to them. They appeared to be walking on nothing, just empty air. The prints circled the camp, stretching out in a continuous loop, as if whatever had made them had been pacing back and forth in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Michael's breath caught in his throat as his mind struggled to comprehend the unnatural symmetry of it all. "Sarah! Jordan!" he shouted, his voice trembling. The others emerged from the tent, and the sight of the tracks froze them in place. "What the hell?" Jordan whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "There's no way anyone could have done this," Sarah murmured, her face pale as she bent down to inspect the bizarre footprints. "Look at the way they curve. They don't even make sense." Michael's eyes darted around the clearing, searching for an explanation, but found none. There were no signs of human activity, No stray belongings, no evidence of an animal passing through. The forest was eerily silent. As the day wore on, the sense of unease only grew. The trio tried to brush off the strange footprints as some bizarre natural occurrence, perhaps the work of a large animal or some prankster, though they knew deep down that neither explanation made sense. There was an unnatural quality to the tracks that made their skin crawl. By evening, Jordan was acting strangely. His usual exuberance had vanished, replaced by a brooding silence. His eyes were wide, as if he had seen something impossible, something that gnawed at his mind and refused to let go. "I don't know what's going on here," he muttered to Sarah as they sat by the fire, Michael a few feet away, his back turned to them as he cleaned his gear. "I keep seeing things in the trees." Sarah looked at him with concern, but before she could respond, a sharp cry pierced the air. Michael jumped, spinning around, but Jordan was gone. The tent flap was still open, the fire crackling merrily as though nothing had happened. "Jordan!" Michael called out, his voice trembling. But there was no answer. The hours passed in a haze of panic. The forest seemed to close in on them, the shadows deepening, the wind picking up and carrying with it the scent of something foul, something ancient. Sarah and Michael scoured the woods, calling Jordan's name, but there was no trace of him, no sign of struggle, no broken branches, no footprints. It wasn't until they returned to camp that they found something even more disturbing. On the ground, near the center of the campsite, lay a single white feather. But this was no ordinary feather. It was too smooth, too perfect, as if it had been manufactured by some unseen hand. Sarah picked it up, her fingers trembling. This isn't from any bird I've seen." As night fell again, the same uneasy feeling clung to them. Neither of them spoke much, but both knew that something had happened to Jordan, something unexplainable, and though they tried to sleep, neither could escape the growing dread that gnawed at their minds. It was then that the dreams began. They were the same for both of them. A dark, endless void filled with featureless faces, pale, white, and without eyes, mouths, or any discernible features at all. They floated through the darkness, staring at Sarah and Michael with an insatiable hunger, as if waiting for something, waiting for them. By morning, the two of them were nearly at the end of their wits. The strange faces haunted them even in waking hours, and they could no longer tell whether they were hearing the wind or the soft murmur of whispers just beyond their hearing. The forest had grown quieter, more oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. It was then, as they packed their belongings in haste, that they noticed something truly horrifying. The footprints were back, but now they were much closer. They had not circled the campsite this time. Instead, they led toward the forest's edge, stopping abruptly at the trees. And then, deep in the woods, came the sound of movement. Slow, deliberate, like something immense was slithering through the underbrush. Sarah and Michael, terrified beyond reason, ran without a word. But the trees seemed to close in around them, as if the forest itself was unwilling to let them leave. Behind them, the sound of the thing in the woods followed, the air growing colder with each passing second. The last thing they would ever see was a shadow emerging from the trees, tall and insubstantial, with no true shape, only a hollow center moving like the wind itself, its hollow gaze fixed on them both. The police found their abandoned gear the next morning, the tent, their belongings, their packs. Everything was left behind, but there were no signs of a struggle, no traces of blood or remains. Jordan's disappearance was ruled a mystery, but the rumors of the Black Hills persisted, whispers of a thing that wandered the forests, leaving hollow footprints and drifting through the woods like a wraith, seeking those who dared to listen. Some say the thing feeds on memory, on the very essence of those who wander too close to its domain. Others say it is simply waiting, patiently, for the right moment to take what it has been denied for so long. And some say that when the wind is right, if you listen closely, you can hear the hollow thing calling from the depths of the forest. Come closer, I have been waiting. I was driving through the endless miles of winding roads that stretch across the dense forests of Washington State when I first encountered him. A hitchhiker, his gaunt frame almost lost among the shadows of the trees, waved for me to stop. I hesitated for a moment, as one does when faced with a solitary figure on the roadside, but something about his presence, something desperate and pleading, compelled me to pull over. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, his face hidden in the folds of a tattered coat. His eyes, however, were the first things I noticed, pale, too pale, with the faint gleam of something far older than his youthful appearance. His gaze, distant and hollow, seemed to peer beyond the confines of the world, as though he could see things that ordinary men could not. "Where are you headed?" I asked, attempting to break the silence. He didn't respond immediately, but when he did, it was with a voice that sent an unsettling shiver down my spine. A rasping, breathless sound, as though he was speaking through some kind of ancient throat, unused for speech. "Spokane," he replied, "but I'd advise you not to go there." I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "It's not safe, you see. There's something there, a thing." He glanced nervously over his shoulder, as if something might be following us. His eyes flickered toward the trees, the darkness beyond. "The man with no elbows." I laughed uneasily, thinking it was some bizarre local superstition or a joke meant to pass the time. "The man with no elbows?" I repeated, incredulous. The hitchhiker turned to me, his face growing pale, his lips trembling as though with great effort. "Yes," he whispered, barely audible. "He crawls into homes at night, through cracks, through shadows. He is everywhere, but nowhere. And you'll never know he's there until it's too late." I tried to chuckle, to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a madman, but the truth is, I couldn't. Something in the way he spoke, the desperate tone of his voice, made it impossible to simply ignore him. His warning clung to the air like a heavy fog, suffocating reason. "You'll see him too," the man said, his eyes narrowing as if he were seeing something I could not. "And you'll wish you hadn't." I glanced at the road ahead, the trees thickening as we entered a stretch of wilderness. The air seemed heavier here, oppressive, as though something was watching, something that existed just out of sight. The man fell silent again, but the tension in the car had shifted. I didn't ask him any more questions. The rest of the drive passed in a muted, unnatural stillness. When we arrived in Spokane, the city's cold, indifferent streets felt almost welcoming compared to the eerie quiet of the forest. The hitchhiker didn't say a word as he got out, merely nodding his head in my direction before disappearing into the shadows of the alleyways. I didn't think much of his words after that. In fact, I attempted to laugh off the strange warning as I checked into my hotel, determined to enjoy a night of rest after the long drive. Spokane was like any other city, bustling, vibrant, filled with people, nothing to fear. The weight of the hitchhiker's warning felt lighter now, even foolish, but the night did not pass peacefully. At first, it was the sound of movement, soft, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of fabric or the creaking of old wood. I lay in bed, my eyes open in the dark, straining to hear. At first I convinced myself it was just the settling of the building, the usual sounds one might hear in an old hotel. But then the sound came again. It was closer now. Something was moving in the room with me, slithering across the floor with a terrible, unnatural fluidity. It wasn't the movement of a person walking, no. It was far worse, far more sinister. It was as though the very laws of physics had been distorted, twisted to allow for something impossible. I held my breath, straining my ears, and I could hear it more clearly now. A soft, almost wet noise, like skin dragging across the floor, each movement deliberate, slow. My heart began to pound in my chest as my mind tried to make sense of the horror unfolding in the shadows of my room. And then I heard something else, something I could not fully comprehend, something beyond the scope of language. A voice. It was faint, muffled, as though it were coming from a great distance, and yet it seemed to be right beside me, speaking in a language that was not meant for human ears. It was a guttural sound, the words slithering into my brain like worms, burrowing into my thoughts, filling my mind with a sensation of dread, so profound it was unbearable. I dared not move, dared not even blink. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my body was paralyzed, caught in the web of whatever force was invading my room. Then I saw it, a shape in the shadows, not fully formed, but there nonetheless. It was the figure of a man, but one that had been distorted beyond recognition. His limbs were impossibly long, and where elbows should have been, there was only the absence of joints. A blankness, a void that seemed to devour the very light around him. The figure's head was tilted unnaturally, and it was mouthing words I could not understand, its lips twisting in grotesque motions as if speaking in a language older than humanity itself. The creature was slithering across the floor, inching closer and closer to where I lay, its movements sickeningly fluid, like something that existed beyond the physical world. I was frozen, unable to scream, unable to move as the figure inched closer. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, the smell of something ancient and forgotten. The whispers grew louder, clearer, and with them a terrible realization. This was no dream. This was no illusion. It was real, and whatever this thing was, it wanted me. The creature was close now, so close that I could feel its presence, a palpable weight in the room. Its shape was flickering in and out of focus, a blur of darkness, as if it were struggling to maintain its form. Its mouth was still moving, its voice slithering into my consciousness, pulling at the very fabric of my mind. It was no longer just words. It was a command, a demand, something so ancient that I could feel it eating away at my sanity bit by bit. And with that final, horrifying realization, I understood its purpose. The creature was here to take something. It was feeding on the terror, the helplessness, the very essence of my being. It was not just a man with no elbows. It was something far worse. It was a presence. I don't remember how I managed to escape the room. The next thing I recall, I was outside, in the cold Spokane night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sky was still dark, the stars hidden by clouds, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. I stumbled, disoriented, but somehow I managed to find my way back to the car. The man with no elbows had disappeared, but the memory of its presence, its terrible, suffocating hunger, lingered in my mind. I never went back to that hotel. I never went back to Spokane. But the hitchhiker's warning echoes in my mind. Every moment, every day, the man with no elbows is out there, somewhere. And no matter how far I run, I know one thing for certain. He is always watching. The unholy storm came without warning. It was late in the evening when the wind began to howl, rising from the sea like the mournful cries of some forgotten thing. I remember that night with a sickening clarity. The windows rattled as though something was battering them from the outside, and the distant thunder echoed in the heavens like the growl of some cosmic beast. But it was not the storm itself that I remember with such dread. No, it was the salt. Our family had moved into the old house on the outskirts of Galveston some months before, a crumbling relic from a bygone era. The house had stood for over a century, and the stories surrounding it were numerous and unsettling. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the house's past, of things that happened beneath the sea and things that had never surfaced. Among the many items we inherited with the house was an old tin container of sea salt. It had been placed in the pantry when we arrived, seemingly without significance. At first, I thought little of it, for the salt was old and worn, the label faded and torn. It seemed nothing more than a forgotten relic of some earlier time. That is, until the first storm came. I recall standing in the kitchen, watching the wind lash the trees outside when it began. A high-pitched, unnatural scream, faint at first, like the sound of a woman in pain drifting through the house. I had thought it was the wind, or perhaps my imagination, but as the minutes passed, the scream grew louder, more distinct, more terrifying. It emanated from the pantry where the salt rested. I moved toward the pantry with a trepidation that I could not explain. The air in the room had become thick, heavy, as though it were charged with some malignant force. And there, among the familiar bottles and cans, I saw the salt, sitting innocuously on the shelf, yet now it seemed alive. The tin container trembled ever so slightly, as if it were vibrating with some internal fury. I reached out, almost involuntarily, to touch it. The moment my hand made contact, the scream intensified, rising in pitch until it felt as though the sound was cutting through my very soul. I recoiled, stumbling back, my heart pounding in my chest. Then came the words. The whisper was soft at first, barely audible over the wind and the screaming, but it was there, unmistakable and foreign, like the rolling cadences of a language I had never heard. The salt began to shift and writhe in the tin, a dark liquid seeping from the container, staining the shelf with a dark crimson stain. It was a sound, a voice, but not one of this world. "Bury, bury me," it begged over and over, the words slithering out in the strange rhythmic tones of Yoruba. The storm raged for hours, but the salt's cries did not cease. My family, my wife Margaret and my children Jacob and Lily, had gathered in the living room, each of us listening in dread as the wind tore at the house and the screaming salt continued its mournful cry. We tried to ignore it at first, attributing it to the storm or some trick of the wind, but the voices never stopped. The next morning, I decided to investigate. The sun had risen in a blood-red sky, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape outside. I took the salt, still vibrating with some strange energy, and drove into Galveston, hoping to find some explanation. It was in the dusty, cluttered bookstore on the corner of the main square where I found the answer. A man named Mr. Abernathy, the owner of the store, was an old historian with a penchant for strange local lore. I showed him the tin of salt, and the moment he saw it, his face turned pale, his hands trembling. "This," he whispered, his voice shaking, "this is from the Suffrance." The name meant nothing to me at first, but Mr. Abernathy's face twisted into an expression of pure terror. "The Suffrance," he continued, "was a ship that sailed from West Africa in the early 1800s. It was a slave ship, cursed from the very moment it left the shores of Africa. Its journey was a nightmare filled with unspeakable horrors. The crew was lost to madness, and the slaves, those poor souls, were treated as nothing more than cattle. But the worst part," he paused, as though he feared speaking the next words would summon some terrible thing. "The worst part," he whispered, "is that when the ship sank off the coast of Galveston, they didn't just bury the bodies at sea. They buried something far worse, something they shouldn't have." I stared at him, confused, as he continued. "They buried a curse. The salt you have, it was taken from the ship's cargo, from the very hold where the bodies of the dead and the damned were stored. And in that salt is the essence of what was left behind. Something evil, something that still remembers." That night, the wind returned, more vicious than before. The salt in the pantry had grown restless. its cries becoming more frantic, more desperate. My family huddled in the living room, terrified, unable to explain the phenomenon that had overtaken our home. Then the salt began to bleed. A crimson liquid began to ooze from the tin, dripping down the sides of the container and pooling on the floor. The scent was rank, a mix of salt and rot, and as the liquid spread, it seemed to stain the very air. The voices grew louder, no longer merely whispering in Yoruba, but now screaming in terror and agony. "Bury me," the salt cried. "Bury me at sea. Set me free." And then, as the storm's fury reached its peak, the most horrifying thing happened. The very walls of the house seemed to tremble, as though the entire structure was groaning under the weight of something ancient and terrible. The windows rattled and the air thickened with the scent of blood and salt. The voices, now coming from every corner of the house, filled my head, drowning out all thought, all reason. I had no choice. I knew that whatever was bound to this salt, whatever curse had been placed upon it, would never cease unless it was buried where it belonged, beneath the waves. In a frenzy, I packed the salt into a bag, my hands shaking with fear and disgust, and ran to the docks. I waded into the cold, murky waters of Galveston Bay, my feet sinking into the mud as I cast the salt into the depths, praying that it would be enough to end the nightmare. As I stood there, watching the storm rage overhead, the voices began to quiet, the screaming salt slowly fading into the dark water. But even now, I wonder, was it truly the salt that was cursed? Or was it the land, the very sea that had swallowed the sufferance, that bore the burden of something far older, far more dangerous than any of us could understand? I returned to the house that night, and the salt's cries ceased. But every storm that comes now, when the wind howls and the waves crash against the shore, I still hear it. The whispers, begging for burial, for release.